But I found, interestingly, that the ones who were in favor of bringing intelligent design into the textbooks were very anxious to divorce it from any idea of religion. They said, we just want good science. And that fits in with my remark that there really isn't hostility to science itself in the West, whereas I think there is in the Islamic world. Actually, we won that argument, and evolution without intelligent design as an alternative is what you find in textbooks used in Texas schools. I certainly don't argue that science can disprove the existence of God, and I also wouldn't argue that science can disprove the existence of fairies at the bottom of the garden. It's just after a while, experiencing the world and not seeing any sign of it, you begin to take those ideas less seriously.
One thing I would say to what you said, Steve, is that the very people who were talking to you, and as I've unfortunately spent a lot of time with those people who have been pushing intelligent design in the schools, when they say they want to teach just want to teach good science, their definition of good science is very different than yours. And so I think that the supposition that they're not hostile to science is probably naive. I think that they're hostile to the kind of science that you would like to do and that I would like to do.
Well, let's at least say that they don't want to march under the banner of anti-science.
That I think is true, absolutely, and they couch it. But the interesting thing is the very people who couch it as good science there, if you read the internal literature, present those diagrams, and so there is that they're very effective in public relations because most of the public respects science still, although there's been a decline in that if you look at the polls. But so I think they're savvy enough to realize that they have to couch their discussion as if they're interested in good science in order to appeal to the voters.
Could I just add another voice to the conversation at this point? You mentioned Richard's book and a couple of quotes there in your Nature review. Richard will be here a little bit later on, but in the interim, perhaps we could add Sam Harris's voice to the conversation. Sam has a book out at the moment called Letter to a Christian Nation, and before that he had a book called The End of Faith, and he's philosophy graduate, but he's also working on a doctorate in neuroscience at the moment. Sam Harris.
I did see it. You never quote me exactly.
That's the purpose of quotes.
It's close enough.
Do you have...
Oh, I think I have your you want to one?
Yeah. Why don't you?
No, actually I'm fine right here.
To the podium.
Yeah.
I'll take it off.
Well, thank you, Roger. And it's really it's a great honor to be here. I'm afraid I'm going to come down very much on Dr. Weinberg's side in this particular debate, though I found much to agree with in Dr. Krause's remarks. I certainly agree that science is not the enemy of morality, and we have to make that clear in a very public way, and I think our dialogue will go in that direction. It's also not even the enemy of mystery, and I think that is something we'll probably talk about when we talk about if not God, then what. But I'm very much a fan of construing this conflict between religion and science in zero-sum terms, because science is intrinsically the enemy of dogmatism. And there is nowhere in our discourse where dogmatism is more celebrated than in the discourse of religion. So I want to talk about this conflict and why I think it exists and why I think we therefore can't ignore it. But briefly, I want to say a few things about just what I think our situation in the world is, because I really think religion is leading us to the edge of something terrible. And I think if you read the news, if you watch the news, you see that much of the world is over the edge already. 53% of the U.S. population believes that the universe is 6,000 years old and that we have no genetic precursors in the natural world apart from Adam and Eve. There was a study done in 34 countries assessing the level of belief in evolution, and the U.S. came in 33rd, just before Turkey. This is embarrassing. But when you add to this comedy of false certainties the fact that 44% of Americans claim to be confident that Jesus is going to return to earth in their lifetime, you see a terrible liability of this kind of thinking, because when you look at the prophecies that describe these end of times events, you see that it's not an exaggeration to say that something like half of the American population is eagerly anticipating the end of the world. I think it should be rather obvious that this kind of thinking provides people with no basis to make the hard decisions we have to make, to create a durable civilization for ourselves, to make geopolitical and environmental and economic policy that has a time horizon of not 50 years, but thousands of years. Now, many of these people are lunatics, of course, but they are not the lunatic fringe. I mean, we're talking about people who can get Karl Rove on the telephone on a weekly basis, and do on a weekly basis. We're talking about Christian ministers who have congregations numbering in the tens of thousands. We're talking about organizations that have operating budgets in the tens of millions of dollars a year, and in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars a year, whose primary purpose is to spread this ghoulish expectation that the world is soon going to end in glory. We're talking about a group like the Christians United for Israel, which is lobbying the White House and Congress at this moment to take a very hard line with Iran for biblical reasons. Now, it may be that we want to take a very hard line with Iran, but it seems to me rather obvious that we don't want our religious maniacs pushing us there. We're talking about grown men and women with immense political influence who literally believe that a confrontation of this sort would be a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and they expect to be raptured into the sky by Jesus so that they can watch the rest of us hurled into a sea of fire. And yet, if you can imagine it,
I'll explain a little bit more after the break.
the picture is actually much bleaker in the Muslim world. And we are meandering into a global conflict with 1.3, 1.4 billion Muslims, a significant percentage of whom view every political and moral question through the lens of Islam, in terms of their affiliation with Islam, which is to say they will side with other Muslims, no matter how sociopathic their behavior, simply because they're other Muslims in conflict with non-Muslims. Now, there are many well-intentioned people in our society who feel an impulse to apologize for all of this, who think that all of the bloodletting we're witnessing in the Muslim world is a result of the militarism and the incompetence and the greed of our own government. Now, I'm convinced this is a profoundly dangerous misunderstanding of our situation for reasons that I spell out at some length in my first book, The End of Faith. And I'm convinced it's a misunderstanding even if we admit that our war in Iraq has been a catastrophic mistake, as I think it has been. I mean, there's no question we have made enemies in Iraq. But there are enemies there that we have not made, or not merely made. And the enemies we have made, for the most part, we have made by virtue of their theology, by virtue of what they believe about the ascendancy of their faith and the one true way to live on this earth. So this is the situation I think we're in. I think faith is playing both sides of the board in an increasingly dangerous game. And the greatest problem with the rest of us, with secularists and religious moderates and scientists, is that we find it very difficult to believe that people actually believe this stuff. Secularists and religious moderates, almost by definition, don't know what it's like to be certain of God, to be certain of paradise, to be certain that the book they keep by their bed is the perfect word of the creator of the universe. And therefore they tend to discount the utterances of people who really are certain as propaganda, as behavior that's really a cover for behavior that's being motivated by economics and politics. I mean, I don't know how many more engineers and architects need to fly planes into our buildings before we realize that this is not merely a matter of lack of education.